The scripture today comes from Amos chapter 7, verses 10 through 15. May the Lord add his richest blessing to the reading and understanding of his word. Then Amaziah the priest of Bethel sent a message to Jeroboam, king of Israel. Amos is hatching a plot against you right here on your very doorstep. What he is saying is intolerable. He is saying Jeroboam will soon be killed and the people of Israel will be sent away into exile. Then Amaziah sent orders to Amos. Get out of here, he said, you prophet. Go on back to the land of Judah and earn your living by prophesying there. Don't bother us with your prophecies here in Bethel. This is the king's sanctuary and the national place of worship. But Amos replied, I am not a professional prophet, and I was never trained to be one. I'm just a shepherd, and I take care of sycamore fig trees. But the Lord called me away from my flock and told me, go and prophesy to my people in Israel. May the Lord bless his word. An Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman all went into a restaurant to eat together, and as they sat down and their tea was placed before them, at the same moment a fly dropped into each of their cups of tea. The very proper Englishman looked at the fly and the tea and called the waiter over and said, I refuse to drink this. You'll have to get me another cup of tea. The Irish, known to be a very pragmatic people, the Irishman looked down and saw the fly in the tea and realized it hadn't been there but just a moment and wouldn't hurt anything, so he picked it up and threw it out and began to drink his tea. The Scottishman from the Scottish people, who are known to be very tight-fisted with their money and just about everything else, looked down and saw the fly in his tea. He picked the fly gently out of the tea and then began to shake it over the cup, saying, spit it out, spit it out. That would have to be pretty tight-fisted indeed to think that a fly was cheating you out of something by drinking some of your tea that it fell into. But people have different ways of dealing with pests. Some people ignore them. Some swat at them. Some leave the room to the pest. The priest Amaziah thought Amos was a pest, and his solution was to have Amos thrown out of the country altogether. Amos was a prophet of God during a time when the Hebrews were divided into two bitterly rival kingdoms. The northern kingdom called Israel and the southern kingdom called Judah. Amos was a prophet from Judah, and he was called by God to travel to Israel to prophesy God's judgment on that northern kingdom. You can imagine how well that was received. To have someone from the rival kingdom come and set up shop and prophesy God's judgment against you? But that is what Amos did. He began by prophesying judgment on all of Israel's neighbors, who were, of course, also its enemies. God's judgment on Edom and Moab and Gaza and Tyre and a whole host of others, each in turn. And you can only imagine his listeners liking this part of the presentation. You can almost hear them say, yes, yes, God, pour out your judgment upon them. They deserve that sort of judgment, the sinners. But then Amos uses the very same language to describe God's judgment coming very soon against their very own nation of Israel. Not so much cheering at that, I'm sure. In fact, quite the opposite. He gets under their skin so much that the chief priest of Israel's chief northern shrine at Bethel, a man by the name of Amaziah, goes to the very king with complaints about what Amos is saying. Apparently, with a word from the king, Amaziah tells Amos to leave Israel. He says, go back to where you came from. Go home and prophesy there. This is the national place of worship. Leave us alone. Don't bother us. We don't want to hear you. So Amos is forced to leave. However, he doesn't leave them alone. Instead of preaching face to face to them, he begins to write to them so that they can read what he will say. You would think that people would want to hear what God has to say, good or bad. If it's good, it is a blessing. If it is a chastisement or a warning, then people can take heed and change to avoid it. But apparently it is the human way to want to plug our ears and get rid of the messenger so that we don't have to hear the message. God, however, still gets his message across loud and clear, so that people cannot say that they haven't heard it. Thus Amos wrote, and we have the book that we have before us today. When we think of sins that beset a people, We often think of personal sins like drunkenness or robbery or murder, maybe false religion or idolatry, certainly sexual sins and the like, prominent in what people think and accuse others of. And no doubt these are included, sometimes explicitly and sometimes inferred, in what Amos and other prophets have to say. But I think if we think solely in those terms, we miss what the bulk of their warnings are actually about. When we read, even in a cursory manner, much less when we actually get down to the nuts and bolts and study it, when we read what God says through the prophets, the bulk of the warnings come about other things altogether. The bulk of the prophetic writings, when they talk about sin, talk about the sins involved in the mistreatment of others. The sins of injustice, of oppression, of arrogance, of hatefulness, of callousness, of indifference toward others, the sin of corruption that thwarts any attempt to change these other sins. I am no social justice warrior. In fact, I'm far from it. However, I think we must take seriously what God says. What he said to his people in the past and what he still says to us today in his word, very important. And a big part of what he has to say has to do with how we treat others, both as individuals and as a society. I am serious when I say that all the Christians I know, particularly in our local churches, are good people who would give the shirt off of their backs to anyone who needed it, good people who would be angry at any sort of mistreatment of others, good people who would act if that mistreatment happened in their presence, good people who want to do right, who want to speak the truth, and who want to live openly as good witnesses to what Jesus Christ can do in a person's life. So I'm not impeaching anybody I know or anybody locally with a laundry list of sins. When we look at the society that surrounds us in this country and in the world, however, what do we see? Unfortunately, we don't have to look very hard to see many of the things that Amos and other prophets spoke of and warned us about. Now, let me tell you, I love this country. I think it's the best country in the world, and I would not want to live in any other. However, we still have our problems, don't we? We aren't in heaven yet, so we're still imperfect. When we look around, we can see some people who have gotten rich off the backs of the poor. And we can see that the justice system works differently for different sorts of people, and not always fairly. I would probably fare better than someone from a ghetto, and I would not fare as well probably as a rich, well-connected member of high society would before a judge. And the difference can be as much as probation versus years in prison, depending on who you are and where you come from. And then we can ask our question, what does our society honor and lift up? Not just with words, but with quality of life. What does it support? Does it lift up honesty and hard work and personal character? Or rather, does it reward more greatly those who tell lies with a roguish smile, who don't do any real work but who look really good in the latest fashions, who sin boldly and without any remorse whatsoever? These aren't just our problems, they're worldwide human problems that have plagued humanity from the very beginning. The issue, though, is what are we going to do about those things and the forms that those things take in our own society, because we live here. We don't have to worry about what happens in Belarus or what happens in China, though we might keep people lifted up in prayer. You know, we see those things abroad, but there's not much we can do other than pray. However, in our own society, there is more we can do. It's very easy to condemn the personal sins of others, and it's easy to condemn the societal sins of other countries. It's even easy to condemn our own society's sins if we don't tread on the wrong feet or try to do anything about them. However, to speak too loud or to take any action that might actually help matters, and you can be assured that the Amos treatment is on its way. People will say, "Go away, don't bother us, we don't want to hear it." So what can we do when we, where we are, live so far from the centers of power, and where our access to those centers of power in high society are probably pretty close to nothing? Well, first thing we can do is pray. Prayer is overlooked as a powerful tool of God. We may say sometimes that we'll pray about something, but will we actually do it? How much time do we spend in prayer? How much heart do we put into it? Prayer is the most potent thing we can engage in if we're sincere about it. Let us make sure that we spend time in prayer and on our knees. Secondly, we can read and study the Scripture to know what God expects of us. We already know a lot of it. Be truthful, don't steal, love others, help others, be just, be kind. Some of it is very basic to humanity in general, as well as to the church in particular. Reading it and studying it, however, makes it more and more a part of our lives the more we do that. As I often like to say, what do we marinate our lives in? What do we marinate our minds and our hearts in? Do we steep them in the things of God or in the things of this world? And thirdly, we can act on what God tells us. We can live out what God tells us in every venue of our lives, whether we're at the grocery store or in the voting booth or at a meeting or at work or online or on the phone or at church or just out and about. Acting consistently in every situation as God would have us to will affect so many lives. And like ripples going out from a pond, it will spread what God says to so many others and to so many other situations. Stand up for right when you can. Be just in all of your dealings. Treat people with love and respect. Speak God's words. Be humble yet strong. Refuse to be moved on what is right, true, and just. Find a way. Better yet, ask God to show a way, and He will. And let all these things be done in love and humility as God asks us to. And we don't have to be preachers or missionaries or elders or Sunday school teachers to do these things. God calls all of us. God called Amos, and as he says here in this scripture, he was not a professionally trained prophet as many were in those days. He was instead a sheep herder and a tree pruner. Yet giving his life over to God, he was a powerful voice that shakes us still yet today. Boy, the world surely needs more Amoses today. The question is, are you ready to be one?